Hey guys, I did a couple of videos a while ago about compressors and limiters and how they work. Today I want to show you a couple of examples of when and why to use them in a post-production workflow. Now if you've watched either of those videos, you already know that a limiter is basically a really aggressive type of compressor. Both of these tools fall into a category called dynamics processors, which are all about controlling the levels of your audio in various ways. You'll see compressors and limiters used a lot on dialogue to get more consistent levels out of a performance. Sometimes in music you'll see compressors used to control the levels of instruments or vocals, sometimes even whole songs. It's all about getting more consistent dynamic range, which is basically the contrast slider of the audio world. High dynamic range in audio means you've got really, really loud sounds and really quiet sounds, and there's a big difference between the two. Low dynamic range being that things are a little bit closer together in loudness. Most people are already familiar with using a compressor on, say, dialogue, for example. You get more consistent levels out of a performance, but I want to talk specifically about using them on sound effects, because you can get really creative there. Gunshots are kind of the most obvious one to pick on because they're used in almost every film and television show out there, but they pose a really interesting problem because they've got this huge, loud transient at the beginning of them, and then they really quickly tail off into something very, very quiet. And if you try and record guns ever, you'll notice that you really can't get a good representation of them unless you really know what you're doing. This is a raw gun recording just straight out of a recorder so you can hear what I'm talking about. That sounds absolutely useless. There's not really anything good or gun-like about that recording. It sounds like a click. Now that happens because you've turned your levels down all the way as much as possible to keep the gunshot from clipping or recording. But if I use a compressor in a really aggressive way, I can get some real life and character out of this. So I'll load up my favorite. It's FabFilter's Pro C. I use it because it's really easy to look at. It shows you exactly what's going on in your audio, but don't think that you can't do it if you don't have the tools that I'm using. This works in any software with any type of compressor out there, and you don't have to be in Pro Tools, you don't have to have FabFilter. If you have a DAW or a picture editing software of any kind, you've got the tools to make this happen. If you need a refresher on how compressors work, check out the link above. Basically, I'm going to try and control the initial level of that big transient of the gunshot, the actual explosion that you hear, and then I'm going to try and really bring out the character of the tail of the gunshot, because that's super quiet in comparison. First, I'm going to set my attack and release to be as fast as possible. That attack is how quickly the compressor responds to something, so I want it to be really, really quick because that transient is immediate. And I'm going to set the release to be quick as well because as soon as that transient decays down in level, I want all of my tail to come back so I can still hear it. Next, I'm going to set my ratio to something really aggressive, like 20:1 or maybe even higher. And when I set my threshold, that's going to tell the compressor anything that crosses that line, it's going to be reduced really, really significantly. By nature of doing that, of course, you're decreasing the overall level of your sound, so you have to use the output or the makeup gain that a compressor has to boost everything else back up. So you've just made your really loud sound really quiet, and then you've taken that new quieter sound and boosted the entire level overall. So let's take a listen. That sounds a lot more like the Hollywood guns that I'm going after, and it's going to give me a lot more room to shape that sound with EQ and bring it up or down in level to get the feeling that I need. Now, like I said, gunshots are an easy example, but you can use this technique on any sound that has a really sharp transient and then decays into nothing, like footsteps, for example, or hand pats, anything quiet or delicate like that. I think footsteps are actually a great thing to take a listen to. If you've got some that are kind of clicky or cut through a mix too much, you can use a compressor to control them a little bit so that they'll sit a little bit more naturally underneath the rest of your audio. These footsteps, for example, have a really, really intense transient on them. But by using a compressor to just control the levels of that transient, I can get them sounding a little bit more clean and much less aggressive. Now you can use a limiter to the same effect here. I find myself using them a lot to do explosion sound effects or design stingers or whooshes to just kind of beef up a sound and make it a little bit more impactful. However, especially in more complex workflows like broadcast television, I use limiters a lot to control the overall levels of my mixes and to keep things from clipping. In my sessions, I break everything up into sort of audio food groups. So I've got dialogue, I've got music, I've got sound effects, I've got backgrounds, I've got Foley, etc. And I use limiters to control the the outputs of each of those food groups so nothing's clipping, everything is kind of balanced correctly. Also, especially in dialogue workflows, when you have a dialogue processing chain of plugins, you'll see a lot of the time on big name dub stages and TV mix stages that dialogue mixers will have a limiter as part of their dialogue chain just to control the levels and make things more consistent. Limiters also take a slightly different approach to loudness control because you're not setting an amount to reduce audio by and then gaining everything up like a compressor would. You're setting basically a ceiling that audio can't get louder than, and anything that you push into it, your limiter will control that loudness, so it's brick walling your levels. And that can be really helpful, again, for stem workflows or for just making sure that your master mix doesn't clip when you're making a print master. Now, of course, you can use compressors and limiters in more ways than just these, but hopefully this gives you an idea of how to integrate them more creatively in your workflow and start thinking about them maybe in a different way. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit like, hit subscribe. I'm over on Instagram at AXK, so come follow me over there. And as always, thanks for watching.